Commodification Gap. And I will shortly present his Werdegang, or his CV, or his profile. He's the acting head of a research-focused politics and planning and an adjunct lecturer at the Institute for Social Sciences at the Humboldt University in Berlin. But he is also at the IRS, so the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space in Erkner, close to Berlin. He received his doctorate almost 22 years ago with a dissertation on Berlin's suburban renewal policy, or urban renewal policy. And he habilitated actually with the book he's presenting. Well, the book is a further elaboration of his habilitation thesis, and he's presenting it today. And thanks a lot for discussing this with us. Before that, he worked at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig. And actually, he was working on shrinking cities, which was quite a very hot topic at some point. Now Leipzig is booming, but at that time, actually it was shrinking. So it's interesting to see how different cycles affect different cities in different moments in time and history. So a very contextualized view on the process. He has worked in many research projects, both national and international. And he served also as a book review editor for the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, and was a member of the board of the RC21, the Research Committee on Urban and Regional Research of the International Sociological Association. And actually, he was also the deputy speaker of the Urban and Regional Sociology section in the German Sociological Association. So thanks a lot, Matthias, for being with us here today. Very quickly, a presentation also of his discussants. Anna Zhelnina, she is also a sociologist, but she's also a writer, an educator, and a person interested in cities and politics. And she works as a postdoc in Helsinki, as I mentioned before, at the Institute for Urban and Regional Studies. She defended a thesis on engaging neighbors, housing strategies and political mobilization in Moscow renovation. So it will be interesting to see the Russian connection here between Moscow and St. Petersburg and the process, if there are similar or different processes going on. The second discussant is Justin Kadi, who actually was a colleague here in Vienna, but he moved recently to Cambridge, where he's an assistant professor in planning and housing at the Department of Land Economy of the University of Cambridge. He was trained in urban studies, housing studies, urban planning, etc. And issues he's working on in his research. And he worked also at the University of Amsterdam, at the Bauhaus University in Weimar, and at the TU in Vienna before that, where he was heading and coordinating the housing research group at the Department of Public Finance and Infrastructure Policy. And it's interesting because following the money very often discloses many of these processes that are taking place in the housing market all around the world. He is an associate editor of the International Journal on Housing Policy, as well as an editor-in-chief of a multidisciplinary journal, The Public Sector. Okay, I'll stop here. I give the floor to Matthias Bernt, and so take your time, and then we will have the discussion, and then we will open up for a Q&A session. So thanks a lot. You can share your screen. Perfect.
So first, thanks, Yuri, for this kind introduction and for introducing me to the audience. And most of all, thank you for organizing this. Oh, sorry, that's my son. I'm really sorry. He's knocking at the door. Just a second. No problem.
You can open the door and let him in. So this is the cover of the book, and of course it's very interesting to compare these three cities because the contextuality is very different, and having a process. Okay, here we are.
Well, I'm really sorry. I just can't get him to use his keys.
Don't
Okay,
worry.
so thanks again for organizing all of this. It's a pleasure and honor for me. And it's one of the rare occasions that you have as an author of a book to have people not only reading this book, but also taking the time to discuss it with you. So I'm very happy to have people from different backgrounds here and having the chance to talk with them about my book. And it's always, of course, difficult to present more than 250 pages in 30 minutes. So I thought what I would do is to talk a bit about my motivation for writing this book, and then give you an overview of the theoretical argument, and present rather shortly three empirical investigations, three empirical gaps that I studied in this book. To give you a bit of an impression how the argument works, how it is applied in actual research. Okay, let me start with the following picture. That is a picture, it's an advertising. It's a photograph which was taken pretty close to where I live in one of the most gentrified neighborhoods of Berlin, and it's actually an advertising for a gym. It says gentrification for your abdominals, right? And when I came across this poster, it really knocked me down, because of course it invites questions. When you're a gentrification researcher and you read that kind of ad, then you immediately wonder what is upgraded, where the gap was before, what is invested, who is displaced, and so on and so forth. But why I show this, the reason why I show this picture here is that I think it speaks for a popularization of the term gentrification. When I started getting interested in gentrification in the 1990s as a student, gentrification was a term that was maybe known to 1 or 2 dozen urban studies researchers in Berlin. By now, every taxi driver knows what gentrification is. You can hardly go to a party without talking about which neighborhood would be gentrified next, and so on and so forth. The thing is that together with this popularization and with the diffusion of the term gentrification, the concept of gentrification has become very blurred. And when people talk about gentrification, it's not often very clear what is meant. In a newspaper, I even came across a paper on a gentrified guitar string, which referred to a concert by Paco de Lucia, who used to be more rough in the past, and now he plays in what the newspaper claimed a gentrified way. With this kind of blurring, of course, the concept loses its sense. My point is that I think that us urban scholars are to blame for this confusion to in some kind as well, in some way as well. Why do I think this? And the reason for this is that the term gentrification is often used very loosely, and it's used very differently in different contexts. Often the idea what gentrification is very uniform and has difficulties in integrating different concepts accordingly. And dealing with a concept that has been invented in London in 1964, then popularized in the US in the 1970s, and using this concept, taking it elsewhere to places as different as Oaxaca and Osaka and Berlin and Kaunas, has remained a problem for studies. And this has, I think, led to a situation in urban studies which is somewhat paradox. The term gentrification is around since 1964, as I said, and meters and meters of books have been written about it. So one should think we know it all. We have enough theory, we have enough empirics about gentrification. But what we see is that nowadays the urban studies world is more and more split into 2 different camps, roughly. One, which argues from a post-colonial background that gentrification is a term that was applicable and useful for North American and West European cities in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, but has lost its meaning when it's taken from there to different geographical backgrounds. So this strand, I quote Ash Gertner, who has written a piece about that, demands to lay gentrification to bed to fade away with the other concepts we once used in the 20th century. Other people, among them Loretta Lees, Ernesto Lopez Morales, Yunbeng Shin, argue exactly the opposite and say that gentrification as a process has become globalized. We have more and more studies from very different places around the world where using the term gentrification makes sense, but it should be used in more flexible ways. So what I think this speaks of, this shows is that there is an issue with using a very general concept like gentrification and making it useful and applicable in different contexts. So we have a tension between the context in which gentrification takes place and gentrification as a general concept. So that's been one sort of frustration for me when I came across gentrification papers in the last decades, because you more and more often have papers on gentrification from some place in the world, which either argue that this place is very different from the original places in which gentrification was theorized and observed, and therefore it's not gentrification, or they would argue it's very different here, but it's still gentrification. And sometimes you even have these two different papers from the same places. I found that frustrating, so this motivated me to get to grips with the relation of gentrification and the context in which it takes place. That's been the one thing. The second source of frustration for me was the lack of political effectiveness of much of the literature. And what I mean with this is not that study scholars are apolitical people or that they are not interested in politics, but that often the general theories about gentrification hardly give much advice for what needs to be changed to undo gentrification. When you talk with policymakers or when you're active in social movements, then very often the discussions you have there hardly have anything to do with gentrification theories, and they are sort of decoupled. So I also thought taking into account actual contexts enables one to use gentrification theory in a way which is more open and more prone to assist political change as well. So these were the two starting points where I started. I think I should say a few words about what I mean when I talk about general theories of gentrification. Of course, gentrification literature has become very broad, and there is a lot of different concepts and theories applied, but I do think that the most universally used political economic explanation of gentrification is the rent gap argument that has been developed by the Marxist geographer Neil Smith in 1977, I think. The background for Neil Smith was indeed the changes that could be observed in the late 1970s in US inner cities, most of which were very much neglected. They were often under-maintained, had faced disinvestment, abandonment, all of that. And this changed gradually in the course of the 1970s when capital and people moved back into the city. So that gentrification was seen as a back to the city movement, first of young educated white people. And the term that the title of Neil Smith's article on this, which became seminal later on, was a movement by capital, not people. And I think that already explains the direction of the argument. So what Neil Smith would argue would be that the building value, and with this the capitalized land rent of a building, decreases over time. Yeah. So what you can get as ground rent from a building over time without further investment tends to decline. And with this, a gap emerges between the potential land rent, what you could potentially get for the building as a landlord or as an owner, and the actual rent, the capitalized land rent that you get. And Neil Smith would argue that once this gap this rent gap is big enough, capital flows back in, the capitalized land rent is pushed to the potential level at the highest and best use of the building, and with this, prices go up, rents go up, and people are displaced. The point is that nowhere in the world markets simply work like this. Nearly everywhere, the level of the potential land rent is defined by all sorts of regulations. The level of rent that can be demanded is limited by rent legislation and so on and so forth. There's also in many countries decommodified stock, which doesn't simply show up as a commodity at the market. So what this model uses is actually, although from a Marxist standpoint, a pure market model, which disregards the impact of institutions into which markets are embedded. And that is the starting point for what I call the commodification gap. With the commodification gap, I argue that housing in capitalist societies is at the same time a commodity, but it's also decommodified or non-commodified to some certain degrees. So what emerges is that the commodification gap is, I quote from my book, the disparity between the potential ground rent level, which can be achieved for a piece of land when it's fully commodified, and the actual ground rent capitalized when it's decommodified, partly decommodified, or non-commodified. And I argue that it is only when this gap is closed that investment into housing becomes a viable option and gentrification is set into work. So gentrification, in other words, demands the relative weakness in existence, bypassing or lifting of components of housing provision which are decommodified, and when this is not achieved, gentrification doesn't take place. So what I'm interested in this book is to see how things like social housing or non-commodified housing stock or rent legislation, planning regulations, how these make gentrification possible or build an obstacle to gentrification, how this alters gentrification, and how this has an impact on the temporal and spatial patterns of gentrification. That's the rough theoretical argument. What I did then empirically is that I studied how this commodification gap manifests and operates in 3 different cities over time. I studied a neighborhood in London, Barnsbury, one neighborhood in Berlin, Prenzlauer Berg, and well, in St. Petersburg, but I'll talk about that later, it was actually difficult to define an actual neighborhood, so I studied the inner city of St. Petersburg. And what I tried to do in these 3 neighborhoods is to follow the development of gentrification over the longest time possible, and to see how it interacted with the change of the institutional environment in which it took place. And on this basis, I investigated, or I conceptualized actually 12 different commodification gaps, which would be important for the emergence and the operation of gentrification in these 3 different neighborhoods over time. I won't go into detail and read them all. For this, you will need to read my 250-page book. But what I thought I would do here is to talk about 3 of these 12 gaps roughly, very shortly, to give you a bit of an idea how this argument with the commodification gap works in empirical reality. And I will focus on the privatization gap in the UK, which emerged in the 1970s and 80s in the neighborhood that I observed. I will talk about the modernization gap in Germany, which was very decisive for the gentrification of Prenzlauer Berg in the 1990s and 2000s. And I will talk about the Kommunalka gap, and I will explain what the term Kommunalka means. It's from Russian in a minute. Let me start with the UK. In the UK, I focused on a neighborhood in North London called Barnsbury. It's a neighborhood in the North London borough of Islington. For those of you who know London a bit, it's about a 15 minutes walk from King's Cross. In the 1960s, this neighborhood was actually a proper slum. Housing was run down, neglected, unrefurbished, high concentrations of poverty, and so on and so forth. In order to deal with this situation, the then Labour-held Council of Islington actually embarked on a regeneration policy, which included buying up rows and rows of houses and municipalizing them. And the idea was to basically knock down these houses and replace them by council housing. That was the situation in the 1970s, and the outcome of this situation is that half of the housing stock in this neighborhood actually belonged to the borough. It was public land, public housing that was owned, that was in the property of the state, of the local state. So theoretically, this housing was not, this half of the housing stock was not even a commodity. It was rather some sort of, what you could call it, a public infrastructure, something that is used by the state to provide home for its population, for its inhabitants. That changed tremendously when Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative Prime Minister, came into power in 1971 and introduced the right to buy in, I think, 1981. The right to buy was a statutory right of council tenants to buy their flat actually at discounted prices. Sometimes discounts were, I think, at a level of 80% of the market value. So when this happened, many tenants privatized their apartment using this discount and later on sold it. And it's important to see that this right to buy kicked in at a moment in London's history, which is often referred to as a Big Bang, when the stock market really took off, when prices exploded, when money was flowing into the city. And if you imagine you were a council tenant back then, had a chance to buy your apartment with an 80% discount, wait for a couple of years and then sell it, it's, I think, clear that you could make an immense profit. And in my studies, I came across homes which were sold 4 or 5 times and are now worth £1.5 million. So from a non-commodity, you ended up with something that became very expensive and that can only be bought by very rich people. And in this process, a lot of profit, of course, was made. So instead of building a firewall against gentrification, this ex-public housing stock, which was unfrozen, so to say, by the right to buy and put on the market, worked like pouring fuel into fire. It even accelerated and catalyzed gentrification in an already popular neighborhood. This is the first commodification gap, which I call the privatization gap, and which was important in this particular place and time to get gentrification going. Let me come to another place, Prenzlauer Berg, East Berlin neighborhood in the 1990s. Prenzlauer Berg, actually the neighborhood I live in, was very much neglected and refurbished in the times of socialism. It's been in East Berlin. And as an outcome, most homes were in bad need for renovation when the wall came down. The point is that in German rent legislation, landlords are entitled to add a share of the modernization costs to the yearly rent. So when, as a landlord, you renovate a house and introduce, for example, modern bathrooms, insulated windows, stuff like that, what you can do is deduct 9%. In the past, those were 11% of the costs, and put them on the yearly rent. What this effects in is that rent usually is pushed up very strongly and very rapidly. In most cases, even above market rent. So many landlords use that as a kind of a silver bullet for bypassing the actually strong tenant protections that are characteristic for much of Germany's rent legislation. So in a situation in Prenzlauer Berg where most homes were in bad need for renovation and investment needed to be done, the effect of that would have been a dramatic rent increase, which would have displaced the largest share of the population immediately. So what happened then is that the boroughs and the state of Berlin basically invented new legislation, new regulations that were based on very courageous interpretations of the German building and planning code. And you had a back and forth of rent legislation, rent regulations between the national state, the state of Berlin, the boroughs of Berlin, who introduced different regulations in order to protect tenants. And this led to a complex regulatory landscape where it really makes a difference when a home was renovated, which tenant moved in at which particular point in time, and how he or she could make use of the existing regulations. This facilitated a splintering of gentrification, where even in the most prestigious, best located housing stock, you still have pockets and trenches, as I call them, in which sitting tenants could hold out and defend their low rents for a while. And just to give you an impression, in the home that I was living in the 1990s, really the rent difference for a 50 square meter apartment per month, depending on which household moved in at which point in time and could make use of which regulation, is something between 300 and 400 euros. So accordingly, there are huge differences in the social structure depending on which regulation was there in time. So that's what I call the modernization gap. And the way this modernization gap was kept open by rent regulations or closed has been very decisive for the geographical and temporal patterns of gentrification in Prenzlauer Berg back then. Okay, let me come to Russia, and well, actually, Anna Zhelnina to talk about that, because we talked a lot about gentrification when I was working in St. Petersburg. Anna was there, actually, at least from time to time, and we had longish discussions about whether or not gentrification would make sense in the Russian context. And I chose this example of gentrification of Kommunalki because I think it represents one of the most interesting and unknown forms of tenure, at least from a West European standpoint or North American standpoint. A Kommunalka it's a term that only emerged in 1918 after the revolution, when the Bolsheviki expropriated the large palaces of the aristocracy and gave away the room to working class families on the basis of one family, one room, one household, one room. So what this affected in is that some of the most prestigious, most sizable apartments in the best locations in wonderful palaces were inhabiting apartments with 100, 200 square meters and up to 10 families living in there. And this photograph symbolizes it to some degree, because different people, different families, different households would use this kitchen simultaneously, each having their own facilities here. From the point of view of an investor, this situation, and it's still there, up to 400,000 people in St. Petersburg still live in Kommunalki. In the historical center of St. Petersburg, Kommunalki are estimated to make up something between 10 and 20% of the housing stock, maybe even more, maybe less, nobody knows exactly. And from the point of view of an investor, these Kommunalki apartments are both an opportunity, a potentiality for gentrification, but also something which is really hard to gentrify. It's a potentiality because usually these are very big apartments in good houses, very good location. So if one could displace the people who live in there, upgrade the apartment and sell it on the market, he or she would most likely achieve quite a high price. The problem is that this is not very easy to achieve, because it's not uncommon that these different households that live in an apartment have very different property rights. It's not unusual to have a room which is owned actually by a person who privatized it using the opportunities after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and now owns this room, next to a person who lives there because he or she rented the room from a property owner who privatized, next to a household who was given that room by the municipality as a social tenant, or somebody who just lived there and refused to privatize the room and still lives there. So from the standpoint of an investor, these are all very different situations. With actual owners of room, property owners, you would need to settle a deal. With people who rent, you would need to settle a deal with somebody who doesn't even live there. And sometimes you could even have different owners for one room. With municipal tenants, you would need to settle a deal with a municipality. So even within one flat, as an investor, you would need to find different deals with people so that they would move out. And you would need to find a deal with all of them, because obviously nobody would buy an apartment for his or her own use with a family that would still live there and whom you couldn't choose, whom you couldn't select. So what this affected in is that although there have always been plans around to dissolve these kommunalki because it's seen as an inconvenient and unmodern form of living by the municipality, by the city of St. Petersburg, these plans largely failed. Up until now, I think, let me check the figures, plans were to dissolve around 96,000 apartments in the 10 years between 2005 and 2015, and 2016, sorry, and by 2015 only 9,000, 10% of it have been dissolved. So it's a very complicated issue, and when you talk to investors, they can talk at length about the frustration this situation creates, and investors told me something like investing in St. Petersburg in the center doesn't create profit, it only creates headaches because you have to settle a deal with everybody, and this drives you nuts, basically. So for gentrification in St. Petersburg, this led to an immense splintering of gentrification, because typically, even in one house, cheek by jowl, you can have an apartment where the dissolution worked and which is now gentrified and bought on the market and inhabited by very rich people, next to an apartment which is still inhabited by very poor people who live under conditions like in the Soviet Union. And the effect is that you will hardly be able to identify a complete neighborhood which is gentrified in St. Petersburg, but gentrification is fragmented and splintered over a wide territory, with instances of gentrification next to instances of neglect, cheek by jowl in the same house. Okay, so that far for an overview and for giving you some meat on how this commodification gap works in different contexts. So let me close with a few remarks on what I think the commodification gap is good for, why it can be usefully applied for urban studies. The first thing which I would claim is that the commodification gap can be used as a tool for breaking free from this particularity versus universality binary that you often meet in much of urban studies. When you use the commodification gap, it's actually clear that the institutional context in which gentrification unfolds is crucial. So it shouldn't be much of a surprise that gentrification works different in Athens nowadays than in the Lower East Side in the 1980s. And one would take this difference as a starting point instead of a problem, for applying the term gentrification. Second, I think that the commodification gap integrates the specific political environments in which gentrification takes place into the explanation of gentrification. And it does not only do so in the form that you often find in the literature, where the state is portrayed as a facilitator of gentrification, but it pays attention to both conditions that enable and to conditions that disable gentrification. So it creates a more dynamic picture where gentrification is open to political change and to political contestation. And what this does is, I think, it enforces a perspective on the policies underpinning gentrification and enables to tell a more political story about gentrification, which is, of course, what I wanted to achieve. And I will stop it here. I hope I didn't talk too long, and I'm looking forward to Anna's and Justin's comments.
So thanks really a lot, Matthias, for this very clear, very precise, conceptually also very sharp distinctions, which I think are very relevant to the debate. And breaking this binary is very important because it doesn't help us further in the debate on these processes of change. So I'll give the floor to Justin for his comments first, and then to Anna. Please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thanks for making it possible that I contribute to this discussion. And thanks, Matthias, very much for the book, which I really enjoyed. I think it's definitely worth recommending it to everyone interested in gentrification studies, but I think also for everyone interested in urban studies more broadly. So it's empirically very rich. You learn about the transformation of three highly diverse housing systems on the national level, but also about three neighborhoods over several decades. So I think already this empirical material is pretty impressive, and there's much to learn from this. It's also conceptually rich. So the Commodification Gap, as I read it, attempts to provide a novel analytical framework to make sense of how the rent gap operates in practice in different contexts at different points in time. And I think doing so, the book actually also makes a broader contribution to of course, very long-standing debates about how to make sense of generality and particularity in urban development. I found three things remarkable about the way the book approaches the topic. The first is that it's a comparative study of gentrification. And I think it's insofar useful to highlight this, as gentrification studies is still a field that is quite heavily dominated by single case studies. And there are so few comparative studies. And I think this has been said for so long already, but here we now have a book that actually does this. And looks at three cases in different national contexts even. The second thing is that the book bridges two fields that are often assumed to be very closely related, but then in many studies aren't, that is urban studies and housing studies. So the book focuses on one of the key concepts of urban studies, of course, gentrification, but I think very successfully links this with one of the key fields in which housing studies works, that is the field of the comparative study of housing systems. So I found this also very insightful and illuminating. The third thing is that, and I think you mentioned this already, Matthias, but I think it's good to highlight again, it provides a political take on gentrification and shows how gentrification dynamics are embedded in the specific political decisions that shape housing systems. I would agree with you that this provides, of course, hope for change and a repoliticization of gentrification dynamics. At the same time, I think the book also shows, and I think that's also the value of it, how these decisions have evolved in institutionally very complex and path-dependent ways over many centuries, actually. So, and in that sense, I think also, even though it provides hope, the book also shows how hard it will actually be to achieve radical political changes. While reading the book, I thought of three broader questions that I want to briefly discuss. And please stop me if I'm going too long. I'll try to be short. The first is, to what extent is our theorizing shaped by our object of study? And if that is the case, is it a problem? So that was the first question that I want to briefly talk about. The second question that came to my mind is that, do we need a more specific understanding of the commodification and the decommodification of housing? And the third question is, do we need to do more work on how the traditional dividing lines in gentrification processes between the exploiters on the one hand and those being exploited become increasingly blurred under processes of housing financialization? A few words about each of these questions. So the first question, to what extent is our theorizing shaped by our object of study? And if so, is this a problem? So the question came to me because one of the things that I did is that I thought about what would actually Neil Smith say about the book's argument. So the book starts obviously from Smith's rent gap and attempts to institutionalize it, as I took it, by showing how states and market interrelations differ across context and time, shaping the specific form the rent gap takes. And in my view, I don't think that Neil Smith had much to disagree with this. And in fact, Smith himself also wrote, as the book also discusses, wrote quite a bit about the role of the state in gentrification processes. But as Matthias briefly highlighted already before, Smith's work on the state is quite different. So for one, he has a more one-sided perspective on the state than the book, seeing the state generally as a promoter of capital accumulation. And so Smith is much less concerned with decommodification, but much more with commodification. Moreover, I think he has much less focus on institutional variety and complexity and the variation of institutions across context. To a certain extent, of course, this reflects his theoretical tradition of radical Marxist geography, but I think to a considerable extent, it also reflects his object of study. So Smith largely studied gentrification in the United States context, and there the state traditionally is much less focused on decommodifying housing, but in upholding its commodification. And so decommodification in the real world that he studies is much less of a thing. Also, compared to the European context, there's much less institutional variety in the regulatory framework for housing, I would say. Even though there are, of course, significant differences between, let's say, New York and Miami, overall, they're probably less striking than between Russia, Germany, and the UK. Plus, what I would dare to say is that there's a certain tendency in US academia not to look so much beyond the United States context in understanding the social world, which may add to certain blindness towards institutional complexity. So as a result, I would say the reality that Smith studied is much more about commodification and much less about regulatory variety. For the work by Matthias, this is very different, of course. Looking at Russia, Germany, and the UK, it's quite easily apparent that the framework developed for the US context is insufficient in capturing this large, complex institutional reality available. Decommodification plays much more of a role, as the book, I think, shows quite convincingly, as also does institutional variety across contexts. So from these differences, different theories emerge in the two cases. So Smith provides a ground theory that mobilizes Marxist concepts of land rent and uneven development to show how gentrification processes operate in housing markets in general. And Bernt, or Matthias, provides what we may call a mid-range theory that is more attuned to context to show how the rent gap operates in practice in different housing systems at different times. And in my reading, very much in line with what we may call the variegation school in urban studies, if that's a thing, that pays much attention to the operation of general processes in different contexts. Is this a problem that the object of study shapes how we think and theorize about cities? I don't think it is. If this wasn't the case, we would have a form of urban studies that misses much of the empirical, diverse reality that we want to study. But I think we need to be aware that such influences exist and remain open for a diverse landscape of theories that emerge in an attempt to make sense of urban development in a wide variety of contexts. That's my first point. The second point, the second question that I thought about is, do we need a more specific understanding of commodification and decommodification? So both concepts are central to the book, obviously, as they are to housing and urban studies more broadly. I feel, but that's just my perspective, that they're often used, but are often not very clearly defined and without little agreement of actually also what they mean precisely. But maybe they have also become so common that we feel that there's no need to define them very clearly. So in the housing studies literature, we find, of course, very different approaches to this. I think it's actually also mentioned in the book. So one of the authors that is important here is, of course, Michael Harlow, who argued that for him, decommodification is the removal of any vestige of capitalist market influence over the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, and hence also of housing. There's a very different other take by John Dowling, who has become prominent with this, who rather focuses on consumption, arguing that two dimensions are actually relevant for decommodification, one being the rule of excess. So to what extent is access to housing dependent on income? And the rule of exit. So to what extent a change in income has the effect that one needs to leave the house or not? So you already see quite a different conceptualization here. But I think the most common approach in both urban and housing studies is to equate decommodification with certain tenures, saying that social housing is considered decommodified and home ownership and renting are commodified, even though rent-regulated private rental housing is sometimes considered to be more decommodified than unregulated private renting. The book by Matthias has a quite interesting, in my reading, but a little bit of a different take. As I read it, the argument is that gentrification is essentially about two things. It's about reinvestment of capital in the built environment, and it's about displacement of residents through this process. And starting from this, it argues that decommodification can be achieved in two ways: by regulations that keep down potential ground rent or make their realization difficult. So investment becomes less attractive. In the case that I think is discussed of social housing, for example, potential ground rents are not realized because of the status of housing as social housing. So the reinvestment dimension of gentrification is altered through regulations. But there's also examples discussed that regulations may dampen displacement pressure, for example, through rent regulation or certain rights for occupants or certain subsidies. So one of the examples that's given here is housing allowances. So housing allowances enable households to afford market rate housing, but they do not have to pay as much as they would have to pay without an allowance, and therefore the displacement pressure is lower. So as a result of this conceptualization, not only social housing, but also rent-regulated private rental housing becomes decommodified. But at certain points in the book, also home ownership is discussed under certain conditions to be decommodified to some extent. When there's a discussion that for outright home ownership, for example, the owners have certain rights to stay in their housing regardless of market pressure. So in that sense, it becomes an example of how regulation dampens displacement pressure compared to free market housing, if I read this correctly. I found this super interesting, but I would have liked to read more how it kind of relates to other conceptualizations and understandings of commodification and decommodification. But perhaps you have some quick thoughts on this already, Matthias, and maybe also I misinterpreted your take on this. Regardless of that, I had the feeling when reading the book that there's a need that we as housing and urban studies scholars do more work on this issue, particularly as the content seems so central. Yet there seems to be certain disagreement, if implicit, in the literature on what we mean by it, and maybe the take by Matthias is actually is a step forward in this debate already. I'll be quick with my third point, so not to go on for too long. That my third point is, do we need to do more work on how the traditional dividing lines in gentrification processes between the exploiters on the one hand and those being exploited on the other hand become increasingly blurred under processes of housing financialization? So there's, of course, a very strong threat in gentrification studies that sees gentrification as class conflict between the middle class on the one hand, who benefits from gentrification, and the lower class on the other hand, who gets displaced. Gentrification in this take is about differential abilities of these two groups to pay rent, and the middle class outbidding lower classes with regard to local housing options. The book, I think, shows quite interestingly how this gets increasingly complex under conditions of financialization, because houses are no longer bought primarily with relation to the rent-paying ability of the middle class, but in many cases with reference to global investment benchmarks. So housing becomes this tradable asset that is increasingly bought by global institutional investors rather than by local households. But this, of course, complicates the traditional dividing lines just discussed. So whereas in the past, it was a conflict between middle classes and lower classes, mediated, of course, by the real estate industry and the state, it now becomes a conflict between lower and middle classes on the one hand and global institutional investors on the other hand. My point, though, is even one step further, because I think the complex point about it is that in many cases, the money that is invested in the property market by institutional investors, putting displacement pressure on lower and middle income households, is the very money that many of these households depend on for their pension funds. So in Europe, public pension funds, for example, are the third largest investors in residential real estate. So the dividing line between who exploits and who is exploited is becoming very complicated, and households may very justifiably resist their rent increases and their displacement, but at the same time, it's their pension money that is in many cases invested in the house which they inhabit. So there's, of course, no solution to this on the individual level, and this requires a structural rearrangement of our housing system. But I feel as housing researchers, we have to do much more to conceptualize these changes and to empirically show how these dividing lines in gentrification are currently shifting. And I thought that the book provides a very nice starting point for this, and to kind of open up also these wider and I think very important debates to be had in the coming years. And I hope this wasn't too long, and I hope it's useful. And thank you very much for the book, and I stop here.
Thanks a lot, Justin. It was long, but I think it was worth listening, because you made the point on many issues which the book stimulated you to think about. And I think the book is as rich as you portrayed in your comments. So I will immediately give the floor to Anna so that we can then open up the discussion later. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Matthias and Justin. I took so many notes. Every time I read this book or talk to Matthias, I have new ideas. So everyone in the audience, highly recommend it. It's very rich and it's really thought-provoking. But to keep it brief, I'll sing 3 praises and I'll raise 2 points for a later discussion. But before I start, I'll make a personal reference. Matthias mentioned that we talked about it a long time ago. And I remember thinking when he decided to include St. Petersburg into his project about gentrification, I remember thinking, why would he do this to himself? Because this is really such an unconventional case to compare and even talk about gentrification. At least in St. Petersburg, people don't talk about gentrification at all. This is not a concept they use in their daily lives. Although I think if they talk to you, Matthias, they would probably understand that gentrification is happening to them. And I think this is one of the takeaways I really, I think you kind of you formulated a good puzzle. Why is gentrification so different? Why does it feel and look so different in these different cities, although kind of technically it still complies with the definition? And this was one of my main concerns initially, that why I didn't think gentrification was applicable at all to St. Petersburg, is that, okay, formally it is there, but it doesn't feel or look that way. And people will use different concepts to describe what is going on with them, with their neighborhoods, and with their homes, and with their housing. But also another thing that I will come back later is this idea that you also mentioned briefly, that even the unit of gentrification of this process is so different in all these different contexts, and it may mess up your neat model. Especially St. Petersburg, again, is one of those examples when you can't even define what is a neighborhood, what is a lived neighborhood, what is a kind of formal unit of analysis. There's no data on St. Petersburg, and some cities are just difficult cases. But enough for that for a minute. I still think that you managed to come up with a concept that helps compare across those different cases. And I think it's a very interesting and valuable contribution. Another takeaway that for me, as a qualitative sociologist, is this idea that gentrification is also a political process. And it's not only the state that is involved in gentrification, it's also other political and civil players. And this is what I really appreciated in your book, that social movements and collective action are also part of this dynamic that you talk about. And the third point that I will be thinking about in the future, and I think it will also be one of the interesting contributions of your book to urban studies and I guess policy analysis, is this methodological comparison, the comparative approach that you test. But I think it also can take many forms. And as again, qualitative sociologist, I think that we can kind of think of different methods of analyzing gentrification, processes of gentrification comparatively, using qualitative research with really careful attention to all these different players involved, like state actors, but also collective players at the city and neighborhood level, and so on. So I think it's a very valuable contribution, and I second Justin here, who mentioned that this is a rare case of an interesting and very thoroughly done comparative project on gentrification. And I promised to keep it brief, so I'll move on to my questions. I'll go back to this issue of neighborhood as a unit of gentrification. I think you mentioned it in the book briefly, but I think you could do more with this, and I wonder if you could talk about it a bit more in your discussion, in your responses. So St. Petersburg, you argue that we can observe and identify gentrification in the city center, but it does not aggregate at the neighborhood level, and this poses a challenge to gentrification theory. And I wonder if this is something that you could do more with. How does that aspect of unconventional gentrification in St. Petersburg challenge the gentrification theory? What can we do with it? And the second question that I have is the question of time, or temporality, if you will. You pay attention to it in your analysis, but there are two different aspects of temporality that maybe you could develop a bit more. I think there's this macro aspect when we think in terms of decades and in kind of terms of policy waves, and in case again of St. Petersburg in terms of post-socialist transition and like those kind of large temporal shifts. But there are also there's also people's time, and this micro dimension of time, how people perceive neighborhood change and how they develop and build their own strategies in response to that. And the reason why I think it's worth noticing, again, an example from not just St. Petersburg, but Russian cities or post-socialist cities in general, if you compare, for example, Moscow and St. Petersburg, Moscow gentrified, the city center gentrified much quicker than St. Petersburg ever could. And again, this goes back to the kind of within nation differences, right? Why did it happen? Because people could not keep up with the capitalist kind of transformation of the city, and they did not understand the value of their central properties at the time when the capital was there to buy it. In St. Petersburg, the processes took longer, and people realized the value of their homes when the capitalists arrived to purchase those homes. So kind of this temporal dimension, I think, deserves a bit more attention. And this is, again, me thinking out loud, but I think there's an interesting layer in your project that could be elaborated a bit more. Yeah, but I guess for the interest of time, I'll just stop here. But let me reiterate, I think this is an interesting approach, and I highly recommend everyone to read the book. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Matthias, would you like first to respond? Yes, because it's a lot of comments and issues, so maybe it would be good to have you responding first, and then we open up the discussion to everybody.
I try. Maybe well, first, thanks for these rich comments from two different perspectives as well. And when you were both talking, I had two immediate feelings. One was that I should have taken more notes, because you, both of you, really grasped what my intention about the book was, what I wanted to achieve, and you put it so nicely that I thought I should write this down and use it for my next talk. And the second was, I mean, both of you made really, really good ideas on how to push the arguments forward and how to make use of it for other research foci and for other literatures. So I would have wished, you know, I mean, if I had a wish list, you know, I would wish to have a global project on what to do with the commodification gap and have you both in my team for different purposes, but still, you know. Let me maybe try to say something on 3 or 4 aspects that you mentioned with your questions. And let me start, I think, with Anna. The first is about the neighborhood as the spatial unit for gentrification research. And I think you're totally right. Historically, gentrification research emerged on the scale of the neighborhood. You know, when Ruth Glass first invented the term gentrification in 1964, what she was interested in was neighborhood change, and she was interested in seeing how the atmosphere, the social character of the neighborhood would change. However, that was the time when neighborhoods were very much the focus of urban sociology, and at a time when something like planetary urbanism was not yet invented. So I think nowadays it would be hard to keep looking at neighborhoods in the form that we did half a century ago. So what I think is that although gentrification is very often associated with the neighborhood scale, keeping with that focus implies a risk of categorically excluding processes which do not happen at the neighborhood level. So what I tried is not to start with these classic notions about gentrification happening at the neighborhood level, being associated with artists and latte macchiato, but really bringing down the gentrification, the definition of gentrification to what I regard as its core, and that is reinvestment of capital into the built environment, or investment of capital. It does not need to be reinvestment, but investment of capital into urban space, into the built environment, and the displacement and class change. And that, I would argue, can happen at the neighborhood level, but can also happen at the level beyond the neighborhood. Some people argue that most of central London is now gentrified and that the neighborhood doesn't play much of a role anymore. In many Central and East European countries, you have this fragmentation, which I described for St. Petersburg. So I think it's sort of not to say goodbye to gentrification, but say goodbye to this classic form of neighborhood level based gentrification. The second thing was on, and I thought, yeah, Anna, of course, of course, you are interested in seeing how people deal with these changes, what it does in their life worlds, how they make sense of it, and how they position themselves in that. And I think that's a very, very valuable focus. And that should be a project which should be done. However, it was not my focus. What I did was not so much that kind of sociology, but it was rather a mix of institutional analysis and historical sociology. So how ordinary people deal with what happens at their doorsteps was just not in the focus, right? But I wish it would come into the focus in the next step. And I mean, if you did a project like this, I would be a great fan of yours, which I already am, but you know, that would be very beneficial. Justin, I mean, really great ideas. I can only try to provide some immediate thoughts about it. The first, well, I still have to think about whether Neil Smith's theory is grand theory and my theory is mid-range theory. Immediately, I would think that what I tried to do is to provide a supplemental of a grand theory to an already existing grand theory. That is the commodification gap as the big concept. And then the mid-range theory would be the individual commodification gaps, which enable variety. But I really have to think about that. I didn't even bother immediately whether it was grand, medium, or small size theory. It's just what came to my mind. Commodification, decommodification. Will, really great. Thanks for pointing my attention to the different treatment of gentrification in housing studies. And I think you are really the housing studies guy here. So in a way, I think it would be fun writing a paper together on this. So I was already somewhat aware of differences in treating the term decommodification, but I didn't really pay much attention to it. The way I treat decommodification, I think, is two things are important. One is that I think decommodification is not an either or, but it's rather a continuum. So you can have commodities which have aspects of decommodification. For example, I live in an apartment which I rented. So that apartment is commodified. Every month my rent goes to a landlord who makes profit with it. But at the same time, I enjoy, in international comparison, beneficial rent regulations which limit the rent increases to a degree which is not so favorable for my landlord. Yeah. So it's a rather continuum, not an either or. And the second thing is that I would see instances of decommodification being possible in all different stages of housing provision, in all different parts of housing provision. Decommodification can relate to finances, to the provision of finance, of capital for housing. It can relate to the production process, to the distribution process, to the realization of profits and to the prices that can be demanded. And all of that is historically contingent and different in different systems, which makes it so complicated and complex. And then most importantly, your remark on financialization. And I think you pick up on an important topic that will most likely become even more important in the near future. And I think it's not only a matter of empirical investigation, but it really goes to the bone of land rent theory. Because with financialization, housing is at the same time a commodity and something that can produce land rent for a particular piece of land because a particular person lives there and pays rent to a landlord, but it's also an asset. And both things do not necessarily need to go hand in hand. In the long run, they need to, because no asset is an asset if it doesn't produce any return. But in practice, this is often decoupled. That's absolutely the case. And I find that this deserves way more attention than it has in urban studies now. And that this is really something which makes the issue very complex. You can, for example, see that when some of the most expensive neighborhoods in London have high vacancies because the property owners there don't even bother renting out or selling their flats because they expect them to raise in price so that they can sell them as assets, right? So, but the assetization of these particular property doesn't even lead to residential change because residents are not needed anymore. Or if people profit at the same time from rent increases, you mentioned that case, because the rent increases channel money into pension funds, which fund the pensions, but they also are threatened by rent increases because their pensions might not be high enough to still pay their rents. So it really makes the issue very complex, and I totally agree. I could only touch on this very lightly in my work, but I think this is really something to pay more attention to. I think I will stop it here. So both thank you very much for your comments. I hope there will be opportunities for all three of us to both continue the conversation and also to work along the lines here. So gratefully suggested here.
Well, thanks a lot, Matthias. I would just second what Justin and Anna said about the book. And indeed, when I think it made a big contribution on making context sensitivity not just as a container, but as an analytical tool to understand differences and not making it black and white, either or, but okay, the concept is interesting. Let's try to make it work in different contexts and why it can be done. And you provided actually a lot of insights on how it can be done. And I think it's a very nice example of how we can transform context or context sensitivity into an analytical tool for comparative research. Because otherwise, each case is a case and you cannot compare, which is totally nonsense in social sciences. There are elements which can be compared, and if you are able to do it in a refined way, making the difference, I think it's a big contribution to the debate. I would say we open up the discussion now. So if you have questions, please raise your hand or write your question in the chat, and we will be happily discussing it. There is already one question, so I don't know if Adriana, Mihaela would like to read it out.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
What a great book, Matthias. I just can't wait to read it, and what a great talk here. I'm not a gentrification researcher, I'm a housing researcher who is often very much concerned by poor housing quality, like what you show us in Russia. And inspired by my own experiences, you know, of living 4 people in one room for 16 years and thinking why gentrification has not arrived so that we can sell it and move to a bigger place. But also inspired by some American list that I follow in a webinar about speculative urbanism in Indonesia, where they say that actually people owning some, you know, poor renting housing in Indonesia are just waiting for the rent gap to increase enough, they sell, and then they just buy 10 kilometers farther away, and they rebuild the same kampung with better condition for the renters. They will have even bathroom and so on. So my question was, we speak always very negatively about gentrification, and I do understand all the negative impact, but can you theorize, and could you also find in your many other chapters of you, which you have not talked about positive effects of gentrification from the subjective point of view that Anna mentioned, and you actually already said it wasn't your focus.
Well, thanks for this question. You're absolutely right. On an individual level, gentrification can be beneficial for many people. And if you go to London and talk about gentrification of North London neighborhoods in the 1960s and 70s or later, you always come across, stories where somebody back in the 70s bought a rundown house when he was like in his early 20s and used to be a hippie. And now, the house is worth $1 million and he can, spend his retirement age at the Costa del Sol and still send his kids to Oxford and all of that, because of selling this house. So many people can profit individually from gentrification, of course. The problem is that at a bigger level, at a more aggregate level, gentrification leads to closing specific spaces, specific neighborhoods. Oh no, I shouldn't use the neighborhood scale anymore, but can close these urban spaces for low-income people. That's what Peter Marcuse called exclusionary displacement. So if a household moves out who was living there before, and the price goes up to a level where no household with the same social status can afford living there anymore. So what this affects on the urban level is increased segregation and the pricing out of the poor from particular gentrified places, areas, right? So what I do think is we shouldn't get stuck in a too easy picture, which would always see residents as easy victims of ruthless landlords, but allow a more broader and more complex picture.
Thank you, Matthias. Indeed, life is always more complex, as our models would like to explain. And by adding a layer of complexity, you made a great contribution. Hilary, please.
Hi. I'm trying to turn, here we go. Hi, Matthias, this was really great. There's so many ways in which this book enriches urban studies, housing studies, the economic sociology also. So thank you for this. What I wanted to say is that it adds to a trend I'm noticing in American urban sociology, which is the institutionalization, the greater institutional approach that the historical comparative methodology brings. And your study really is another example of it. In the American case, we're seeing new books on building inspectors, appraisers of housing, landlords, taxes, the tax codes with respect to housing. So, all of these institutions that regulate the housing market are getting very specific attention. Now, in the American case, it's mostly with respect to racial segregation because it has racially unequal impacts. But nevertheless, as part of this larger trend, your book adds to greater insight into institutionalist analysis in urban studies. So congratulations, that's all I have to say.
Well, thank you. And well, I would love to learn more about it. I see I need to read more American urban sociology, definitely. So that's a great tip. Thanks.
So Hilary, there was no question. It was just a comment in the price of a book. Okay.
Well, I could ask the question as how does institutionalist analysis enrich our view of gentrification? And maybe there are other institutions that we might think about by introducing this approach that of decommodification, ways in which the gradations of decommodification are at work. For example, through taxes, through lending, through inspections, through building codes, through zoning and land use regulation. I could go on.
But I treat that rather as a suggestion and a wish list than something to answer, right?
Obviously,
so I hope some people will do exactly what you're suggesting now.
Well, indeed, like you did for the commodification gap, introducing a nuanced analytical toolbox, the same could be done for policy instruments to intervene in the housing market and on rent regulation, on displacement or eviction regulation, and all of them, because probably the differences between eviction, I don't know, regulation in Vienna might be very different from eviction regulation in Berlin or in Paris or London or somewhere else. So there is, like you fine-tuned the understanding of a commodification gap, you might also fine-tune the role of different policy instruments. And in political science, there is a whole governing through instruments literature. Could add an additional layer of complexity to the framing of a complex process you are analyzing. So, okay, I see there is a new question. Fyodor Bezalov, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation, and I hope I will read the book soon. My question is connected to my research, which is also about St. Petersburg. I've studied a bar street in the center of St. Petersburg. You know, I think Rubinstein Street, full of bars, hotels, etc. And you mentioned this, but could you please comment more about the role of hostels, hotels, bars, restaurants, etc. in the process of gentrification? Because these spaces, they create space for different classes, for different people, and they work with audiences directly. So it is not connected with housing and rent directly, but with different people, different classes, and with changing the neighborhoods or urban space. So could you please comment on that a bit more?
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because actually Ulica Rubinsteiner, when I first visited it like 10 years ago, was one of the main question marks for me. Because I mean, when you, just for people who don't know that place, it's a street in the center of St. Petersburg, which has a lot of bars and is very well popular for a night out, basically. There is also a lot of more and more hostels close by, and more Airbnb apartments. And well, when you know the commercial side of gentrification, the aesthetics, the kind of consumption culture, then Ulica Rubinsteiner perfectly fits in. You have the same kind of bars that you would have at the Lower East Side in Manhattan, or at Friedrichshain and Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin, and so on and so forth. I think there is even a Berlin bar, which looks exactly like a Berlin bar would have looked like in the late 1990s. So visiting that place, I thought, well, that must be gentrification, you know, but then I learned that the actual residential population is a very different one. It's still very mixed, right? So that's what motivated me to find out why, you know, this link between commercial gentrification and residential gentrification didn't work in the way we would know from many Western cities. First, thanks. Second, I think what you point to is a discussion that has already been done in urban studies literature on the relation between gentrification and the expansion of short-term rentals and Airbnb and stuff like that. And I think David Wexmuth did some important work on that in New York City, arguing that that long-term renters are in this case displaced by short-term visitors and short-term rentals, so that it could still be called gentrification. The problem, I think, with this form of gentrification is that it's very contradictory. On the one hand, of course, renting out a flat to people who are in a city only for a couple of days or weeks enables way higher profits. So from the point of view of a landlord, it's advantageous. At the same time, usually tourists produce such a lot of noise, do harm to the neighborhood atmosphere and so on and so forth, that it also creates negative effects on the real estate, on the property value. So it's very contradictory in a way. But I think there's literature out there, both on the relation of gentrification and short-term rentals and touristification, which argues that it's a new form of gentrification. And there is also a lot of literature on the regulation of all of this. Much of this has been written by Claire Colombe, who's here in the audience, and sends a link.
Thanks a lot.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Thanks also, Claire, for the link in the chat. So who's interested in this issue? Very good. Other questions, comments? The floor is available for everybody. So don't be shy. If not, I have another small comment, which relates to what Anna was mentioning in her comments about the role of social movements and the role of actors, which are not the state. And actually, this brings me back to a more theoretical framing of a relationship between the actors, institutions, and macro trends. And indeed, my impression is that institutions could be seen actually as creating the framework within which actors might act. And that's why probably the actors in St. Petersburg might have a different take on the process of gentrification than the actors in Berlin or the people in Vienna or in Paris or London, because the contextual conditions are different, but also the institutional frame which provides resources, regulations, instruments to counteract the negative effects of gentrification. So the actors are relating. So it's a relational space, and they relate to the issues that are, in a way, given. Okay, there are a lot of evictions. What do we do? Why there is no eviction protection, and etc., etc. So they react to the lacking of the existence of specific instruments and options. And from that point of view, I think an institutional analysis, as also Hilary was mentioning, is very relevant and interesting because it allows to connect the micro and the macro trend. So everybody is speaking about neoliberalization, but actually neoliberalization is very different in different contexts. And from that point of view, the filtering that institutions are doing from these macro trends seems to me very relevant to understand actors, claims, needs, necessities, outbreaks, violence, or just sitting there and being happy about what they have, as sometimes it can be as well. So from that point of view, I think it's a very nice approach and helps a lot also to justify the institutional approach, the richness and the lots of consequences of having a proper institutional approach to understand also the micro, so going in the direction of Anna's requests, and also of the macro trends. It's not everywhere the same.
I can only agree. I think it's important, with some of the economic sociology literature has pointed out that institutions are important for human behavior because they provide what North calls the rules of the game, which means they provide a background for expectations and they steer the behavior of individuals because they provide, so to speak, the field in which the game takes place, right? And you can see that all along. I mean, let me give you a very practical example. Coming from a country where renting from a private landlord is a normalcy, 85% of Berlin's households are renters, are tenants. and where renting is regulated, I always found it very striking how so many Londoners, I think it's now more than a quarter of all households, can accept living as private tenants with hardly any protection. I always thought that must be, something which is taken up at the political stage. However, it is hardly done so, because I think the whole institutional background provides a way in which expectations and strategies and behavior is framed, in which most Londoners would rather become owner-occupiers than protected tenants, right? And this then frames political struggles, public opinion, and so on and so forth, which then has an effect on policies and on the way institutions are built. So you have a very complex relationship between institutions, individuals, political struggles, which works in all sorts of ways, in all directions. So I only agree, this opens up doors both to a more macro analysis and to general theory, but also to a more micro analysis. Absolutely.
Perfect. Very good. Yes, we are very much on the same page. I see there is another question. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. Jingling Cheng.
Hi. Hi.
Go ahead. Yes.
I'm Yiling Chen. I'm in the Wyoming in the United States. Yeah. I haven't read the books. I feel hesitant to ask questions, but I do hear a lot of concepts I found very useful. And I just went to the AAG conference. In this AAG conference, the UCLA geography people, they actually organized a very big session about housing crisis. Yeah. And you do see that there's a lot of many interesting discussion coming from the US. And then you also see that there's a lot of, for example, like Michael Stopper keep comparing US and Europe. And you just found that, yeah, social movements are important, but in order to initiate the social movement, you have to some more moral statement. For example, rights, tenants' right, whether tenants has rights. You have to persuade the people in particular country that certain new ideology that's not existing in their own society. Yeah, and also I coming from East Asia, I also feel those very different concept coming from the society, the rights, the commodification, but because a lot of developmental state in East Asia are so much about economic growth. And then, so you talk about the commodification can be very difficult statement. So I just coming from this discussion, and also I'm very curious about how these ideologies play a role, because in certain countries, they just don't have this concept. And but sometimes in other countries, the certain concept also play a very big part. For example, like Taiwan, properties coming from your ancestor, so you don't sell it easily because this is the way you preserve your own ancestor root. Yeah. So if you kind of do this comparative study across country, you just found there are many differences. Yeah. And okay, very chaotic, but just to contribute the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, again, I totally agree. It's, I think my take on this state and on policies is in a way very much influenced by Gramsci and by Poulantzas. So I see the state as, I quote, crystallization of balances of forces in political struggles. And obviously these political struggles are influenced by hegemonic ideas, by what people think is appropriate, inappropriate for them in a given historical and cultural and political context. And these contexts are very different, and these differences go back to history. So in this book, for example, I discuss about the ordo-liberal foundations of the Federal Republic of Germany and how much they influence what is seen as appropriate in housing policies, and how housing policies even go back to World War I, when the emperor introduced a ban on evictions, and how much this was decisive, and how this led Germany on a very different route than England and Russia. Unfortunately, I hardly know much about East Asia at all, but if one had done that kind of analysis for a developmentalist state like South Korea, of course, one would have seen other differences and other impacts of ideologies, histories, institutions. So I see my analysis not as something encompassing, which covers all sorts of cases, but rather as a tool that can be used and taken to other places, other contexts as well. And if people find that useful and study what I tried to do, what I did in other contexts, I think we would end up with an even richer picture and a more global kind of knowledge. But that's just what I could do in contexts where I speak the language, at least to some degree, and where I know the places a bit, which also allows me to see some of these backgrounds, which I wouldn't have been able to see in, let's say, Kenya or in Colombia, which I just don't know and where I don't speak the language.
Thanks, Matthias. There is a new question, Gregory Old. I hope I pronounce it correctly.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just go back to this short-term rentals and commodification and gentrification issue. It's just an example. So I met Matthias in Budapest. He was staying in the inner city of Budapest in an apartment that was on the ground floor of an inner courtyard, and he could rent an Airbnb. So that apartment is very bad to live there your whole life. And it was freshly painted, but you saw it's freshly painted, or actually I saw, because it was so moldy that they painted it like every half year. And so this particular apartment in that part of the city was not a commodity at all, because it's bad to live there. So why would you buy it to rent it out? Because then the rent you can take is very low. But then this opportunity of short-term rentals came, and that crappy little apartment was, a perfect place to stay for a few days for foreigners, and it was then still cheaper than a hotel. So this is what I wanted to add to Fedor's question, this discussion that, and yeah, this adds to Matthias' definition or his talk that, yeah, this painting of the moldy wall was the investment in the built environment. So there wasn't much investment in the built environment. So I'm sorry, I don't want to, I just wanted to take this example.
Yeah, but you could also buy this apartment because you can make a profit with it from people like me. So that makes it a commodity.
Yeah, I wanted to say something like this, that this whole opportunity of short-term rental came up. So that was, let's say, a historical change. And that made the commodification.
You mean that in this case, it was positive because there was no use for inhabiting this place because the living conditions are not adequate for longer periods of stay?
I didn't mean any normative assessment here, just to talk about commodification. So if the owners were, for example, forced not to keep this apartment empty, and if they are not allowed to use it as a short-term rental, well, it could be like a cheap rent-controlled social housing, or like first housing for former homeless people, etc. In social housing, so many of these houses and apartments didn't have bathrooms, and now there is a law in Hungary. I mean, not now, but for 20 years that the municipality cannot rent out an apartment without a bathroom. And for a homeless person, That would be much better than sitting in the street or go to a terrible shelter, but it's not allowed. So I was not saying that this is good or bad. I was just saying that this particular historical, let's say, change with short-term rentals and the rise of tourism was another commodification gap, let's say that.
Okay, Matthias, you want to react on that, or?
Well, no, not really, because Gergely actually said it all.
Okay.
I mean, this apartment had a status as a commodity, but was practically not commodified because it was in such a bad shape that you couldn't make profit with it, and due to Airbnb and due to the lack of regulating Airbnb and the non-action of the state, a commodification gap appeared, which could be exploited by renting out the apartment as a short-term rental. So I think it's a wonderful example how the whole thinking about commodification gaps can be used in other circumstances, and with including, you know, modern global developments like Airbnb.
So we have already
nothing
examples of application during the presentation immediately applied to realities. Very good. Okay, any other question or comment? If there are no other comments or questions, yes, Matthias?
Just provided that the discussion is over, I brought a flyer with a discount code for people who are interested and could order the book. So if the discussion is over, I would love to show it so that people can profit from the discount if they wish to.
Absolutely, yes, please. We can also send it by email to all registered participants.
Oh, that'd be great.
So that's definitely an option.
I hope that's visible. I guess that's too small, isn't it?
It's very small. Maybe you can send it to me and or to Breeze.
It's very easy. It's no, that doesn't work properly. But it's SSHJB. But I'll send it to you, and if you can send it around, perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, wonderful. So thanks a lot, Matthias, and also thanks a lot to Justin and Anna for accepting being discussants in this very interesting discussion. Thanks to all participants. And before leaving, the next appointment is on May 3rd, I think. Is it correct, Breeze? Yes. And we will be discussing the book by Federico Savini and others about post-growth planning in cities, beyond the market paradigm. It's a completely different topic, but again, the market is around still, and we think about options of overcoming the market, like in gentrification debate. And today we saw that the role of institution is very important, and maybe also in planning and post-growth planning can play a very relevant role. So we look forward to meeting you again, and thanks a lot again to everybody. And
thank you for organizing all of that, and also thank Breeze for the technical assistance.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So have a nice evening.